Hello everyone, and welcome back to another tactical fly fisher video. This video is a follow-up to the last one that we did about how to see strikes visually on your sighter when you're Euro nymphing. And in this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips to help you go about doing that. Back when I first started to Euro nymph in 2005, I had already had about 10 years of relying on strike indicators or dry droppers as my primary methods of nymphing. And as such, I became really comfortable with looking for indications of a take on that indicator or that dry fly. And so when I moved over to Euro nymphing, or started incorporating it into the techniques that I use, of course the most natural way for me to learn to spot takes was visually. And I naturally made that transition pretty easily, where I was looking for visual indications of a take on my sighter instead of on an indicator or a dry dropper. And that transition was pretty easy for me, but I realized that for a lot of folks, it tends to not be. So under the gospel of strike detection, according to Devin Olson, I think you should be relying primarily on sight as your form of strike detection when you're Euro nymphing. But over the last few years, as Euro nymphing has become more and more mainstream, I've looked around on social media and on various websites and things like that, and it seems like a lot of anglers are relying on feel primarily as their form of strike detection when they're Euro nymphing. And I think there are a few reasons for that, which I'll kind of cover peripherally in these tips. For me, you're going to see more takes than you'll feel, because a lot of the time the force of that take is just not going to move all the way up the leader and through the rod and to your hand to the point where you're going to feel a take. So if you'll learn to spot strikes first, and then maybe let feel be a secondary confirming reason as to set the hook, then I think you're going to see more takes, you're going to have more reasons to set the hook, you'll end up setting the hook earlier after a strike happens, and you'll end up hooking more fish as a result. So let's move into 5 tips that will help you go about doing this. Tip number 1, you need to master your casting accuracy. Back when I was guiding, one of the biggest struggles that I would have is I just often couldn't move beyond simply getting the angler I was guiding to put the fly where I wanted them to put the fly. Their casting accuracy was poor enough that it might take 10, 15 tries just to get a fly into a pocket or a seam along a bank or a specific target lie that I was wanting to have them target. Obviously, that's important just from the frame of reference of actually showing a fly or your flies to a fish. If you're not in close proximity to a fish with your fly, they're probably not going to move very far to take it. So the more you can put your fly in a target lie, the better off you are as far as actually getting a take in the first place. But when it comes to the topic of this video, if you don't know exactly where your leader is going in the first place, if you cast towards a target and your eyes are looking towards that target, but your leader, and more especially your sighter, lands off to the side of that target, then your eyes have to readjust and go into scanning for that sighter. And you're just going to have a harder time seeing it. So if you can get your casting accuracy down and you have command of exactly where your leader is going, you know exactly where to look for that sighter from the moment your fly touches the water. And then you can see that sighter from onset of the drift all the way through, and you're much more likely to actually be able to see those visual indications of a take than if you're scanning in the first half of your drift for where that sighter went. And in addition, your drift's going to be better because you're going to be controlling that drift better if you know how your leader is behaving and how your sighter is behaving throughout the drift. So I cannot communicate this enough. Master your casting accuracy. If you can't hit right along a bank at 20 to 25 feet within inches of a rock, or you can't hit a dinner plate in your backyard at 20 to 25 feet of cast beyond your rod tip, then you need to work on that casting accuracy, and it's going to pay off big dividends out on the water if you spend some time working on it. Tip number 2, make your entire leader out of a visible material. A lot of the older Euro nymphing leader formulas that I used all the way back to the earliest days of me starting this, but especially in 2007 when I started working with much longer French leaders, a lot of those leader formulas had Maxima chameleon for the butt section of the leader. And the reason why I typically chose chameleon is because it's a stiff material that transfers energy well. But back in 2016, I switched over to microliters in the fall of that year. And because of my previous experience with chameleon and thicker leaders, I brought chameleon over into the butt section of the first few formulas of microliters that I began to use. And so I would often start with a 4 or 5 pound test Maxima chameleon, hoping that it would bring some stiffness into a microliter to help me with energy for turnover. But what I found, unfortunately, in a couple of competition sessions is that I had some catastrophic failures at the knot connection between that chameleon and the cider, because that stiff chameleon just didn't connect well with the knots to a more supple cider material. So I started playing with or experimenting with formulas that just had a fixed length of cider material. And not only did I find that I didn't really need any stiffness in the leader once I went micro, because really the main determinant of where my cast was going was learning to manipulate the weight at the end of my leader with the cast and have that be the primary source of direction for the cast instead of that actual energy transfer in the leader. So the thinner you go, the less your leader essentially has an impact or an effect on the trajectory of your cast. But in addition, what I found was that my leaders got stronger when I didn't have extra knots in them, and they were just simply easier to see. If I had an entire section, 14, 15 feet of cider material to a tippet ring and then my tippet afterward, then it was easier for me to pick up where that leader was going during the air before my leader or my flies landed in the water. So if you can start to make your leaders, whatever diameter you are at with your leaders, if you can start to make them out of a fully visible material for the length of your leader until you get to your tippet, then it's just simply easier to see them. And the more of your leader that you can see, the more you can watch for angle changes, curvature, going to straight, any acceleration or movement of the leader that signals the take. That'll be easier to spot if you have that fully colored leader. And it'll help you also pick it up right at the beginning of the drift, like I talked about in the casting accuracy tip before. Following up on tip number 2, tip number 3 is, if you're not there already, switch to a microliter or go about that process of working your way down to a microliter. With reference to strike detection, let's back up here and look at some basic physics when it comes to microliters and maybe what they might help you with regarding strike detection. All right, so if you don't remember, let's walk back or take a trip back to high school physics and let's talk about inertia. What is inertia? It is the tendency of an object to stay in motion or at rest unless an external force is applied upon it. Inertia is also closely tied to Newton's second law of motion, which states that force is equal to the mass of an object times its acceleration. Now, if we rearrange that equation a little bit, we'll see that the acceleration of that object is equal to the force applied to it divided by its mass. So in order to make an object accelerate more, you either have to apply more force to it or you have to reduce its mass. Now, what on earth does this have to do with Euro-nymphing and strike detection specifically, as we're talking about in this video? The object that we're referring to when it comes to strike detection is your leader. It is the acceleration of that leader that we're looking for when we go to look for strikes visually on your cider. So the goal of a typical Euro-nymphing drift is to make your cast and then adjust your slack and pace your rod tip so that your leader maintains a certain angle more or less and keeps pace with the drift of your nymph at whatever level that nymph reaches. So if you're trying to reach the bottom, you're trying to keep pace with that nymph when it's near the bottom, and you're trying not to manipulate your nymph more than you have to in order to make that happen. If we make the assumption then that we're not accelerating the leader, we're just kind of keeping pace, keeping that leader in motion with our rod tip during the Euro-nymphing drift, what is it then that accelerates a leader in this case? It is the force of a trout when it comes and takes your fly and it moves that leader and accelerates it, from the the regular motion that it's keeping as you're keeping pace with the drift. So going back to that equation again, how would you make the acceleration of that leader more obvious or make that acceleration greater? You can't really change the force that the trout is putting in when it takes your fly. It's going to have a predetermined force based on the behavior of that individual trout as it intercepts, takes your fly, and either sits and holds there or moves back to its position. That's the force that's going to move your leader. So how do you increase the acceleration? You got to reduce the mass of the leader. If you can take that thicker Euro nymphing leader formula that you have that might have a 15 or 20 pound butt section, and you reduce the mass greatly by going to a micro leader that might have 4x, 4.5, or 5x as the whole length or butt section of that leader, that's a lot less mass in the leader, and you'll get more acceleration out of that force that the trout applies to eating your fly. And if you get more acceleration, the leader is going to move more and takes become more obvious and easier to spot. All right, tip number 4 is to fish the lightest nymph or nymphs that you can get away with to get to your target depth. Now this tip relates back to tip number 3 in that you can fish less weight in your flies to get to the same depth if you also have less mass in that leader that you're fishing that is trying to pull them out of the drift they're in. So micro leaders do help you with this tip in being able to fish less weight and still reach your target depth. I'm a firm believer that trout are generally a lot more willing to take your nymph if it approaches them more or less on their level and on a more or less horizontal plane. So what am I talking about here? There's an example on page 174 of my book, Tactical Fly Fishing, that talks about this in detail. But basically, when I've been sight fishing to trout, I tend to notice that if I get the amount of weight right and I cast far enough up above them, that with a lightly weighted fly, that fly is able to just gradually sink to their depth and approach them more or less horizontally. I get a lot more takes that way than I do if I fish a heavier nymph and I have to cast closer to them so that it, on that steep decline or that steep descent that it has, it approaches the fish and gets to their level, but kind of more like it's falling out of the sky. I've watched trout either reject or spook to nymphs that are behaving like that repeatedly, whereas if I can get that Goldilocks amount of weight, where that fly just gradually descends and approaches that fish, I'm much more likely to catch it. When it comes to Euro nymphing, there are basically 2 ways of going about getting your flies to approach a trout on that horizontal plane at their level. The first one, and the one that I think a lot of people take, especially early on when they're Euro nymphing and new to it, is they put on really heavy flies and then they basically just pull their flies or tow them or lead them, as they're often taught, through the drift to keep them off the bottom and pacing along. The other option is to fish less weight and then learn to manipulate your drift less so that that fly can get to depth and then drift in as close to a natural manner as it can in the depth that it ends up reaching, hopefully down near the bottom where the fish are at. The second option of fishing less weight does take more attention to detail and generally more skill and more adjustments to the leader, which is, I think, a lot of the reason why many folks don't end up going that route. But in my opinion, not only do you get more takes because you get a little bit more natural manner in your drift, but you actually end up spotting more strikes, which is the whole topic of this video. Now, why is that the case? Going back to that last video that we just did with those visual examples of takes, I got a lot of people commenting that one of the things they learned from the video more than anything was actually that I had far less tension in my leader than they expected I might. In those examples, I was fishing a 2.3 millimeter fly, just a single fly on 7x tippet, and then my whole micro leader butt section was 5x diameter. So I had a very thin micro leader without much mass. But what you'll see in the video or in this clip that I'm about to play is that there's still a fair amount of curvature in my leader. So I talk about the benefits of micro leaders and that they reduce the amount of sag, but if you're fishing lightly weighted rig, you're still going to have some sag from that leader if you're not pulling your fly or your flies along faster than the current they're in. So if you're trying to match the pace of the current that they're in and you're fishing a really lightly weighted rig, there isn't much tension that fly itself is going to put into the system. So there's still that curvature in the leader. Now, why is that a benefit to strike detection? It's that curvature that I'm watching when I'm looking for takes. That curvature straightening out, hesitating, any angle change that I get within that, that's the acceleration that I'm talking about when I'm looking for strikes. If you fish a lot more weight, then you have to pull your flies through the drift, and there's a lot more tension in your leader. It ends up looking more like a laser that's just completely straight. And if it's completely straight, there's not that curvature that you can look at to help you spot when you've had a take. So if you'll fish less weight, in my opinion, not only will you get a better drift and hopefully get more takes from fish, but then you'll have that curvature in your leader to help you watch for takes when that curvature straightens out. Tip number 5, this is our last one. This tip is to look really for anything. Any of the slightest indication, movement, hesitation, twitch, angle change, look for an excuse. Any reason to set the hook. Don't wait for something dramatic to happen. Now, back when I was guiding, my wife used to tell me that I would regularly have a recurring nightmare. And during that nightmare, I would yell, set, 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 and I would twitch. And the reason why is because I often spent a good deal of my day telling the customers that I was guiding that they should set the hook, because they were looking for something big to happen. Whether it was a trip where we were fishing indicators or dry droppers, or a trip where we were fishing Euro nymph rigs and looking at the sighter, they would be waiting for something giant to happen, like that indicator to swim off, or that sighter to move over a foot and dive underwater or something like that before they would actually set the hook. That's not the reality of most takes. Most takes are far more subtle than you might think they would be. Occasionally you're going to get lucky and a trout is going to really aggressively take your fly and that sighter is going to jump. And I had a couple of examples of that in the video that we just did. But most of the time, you're just going to get the slightest little angle change on your sighter, or that curvature that I'm talking about in the leader is just going to go a little bit straighter. And if you start looking for excuses or reasons to set the hook from any movement at all that happens in your sighter, then you're going to have a bigger sample size in your brain of movements. I set the hook, and then what happened? Either I hooked a fish, or I realized that my fly just ticked bottom, or it just got in a separate current than what it was in originally and it changed pace. But if you don't set the hook in the first place, if you don't react to that movement, if you just think, oh, something weird happened, it just drifted a little different for a second, then you're not going to know. And over time, you'll build up enough of a memory bank in your head of images of when it was a trout taking your fly and other images when it wasn't, that you will learn, occasionally when you see a sighter move that you don't need to set the hook because it was just your fly resting on the bottom, or it was just your fly that sank through those faster currents in the top part of the column, but they got into that slower part and then your rig downshifted, like I've talked about in previous videos. But you have to set the hook initially on pretty much everything that you see before you're going to get that memory bank that you can draw off of down the road. Okay, those are your 5 tips for helping you see more strikes. Tip number 1, master that casting accuracy. Go spend some time, get better at casting. Tip number 2, make your entire leader out of a material that you can see. Tip number 3, if you haven't already, try fishing a micro leader. Reduce that mass in the leader, get more acceleration, and your takes will be easier to spot. Tip number 4, start trying to fish less weight to get to the same depth. Get to your target depth with the least amount of weight that you can possible, and you're going to get more visual cues to look at when you're looking for strikes. And then tip number 5, don't wait for something big to happen. Look for any tiny cue on your sighter that says to you, something happened that I didn't do with my rod tip. Set the hook. Hook sets are free. Use them. All right, if you enjoyed the video, you guys, give us that thumbs up on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to our Tactical Fly Fisher channel, And then please come on over to Tactical Fly Fisher, to our store at tacticalflyfisher.com, and we're here to help you out with any of the things that you might need for a trip to the water or a tying session at the fly tying bench. Thanks again for watching. We really do appreciate your support, and we'll see you soon in another video.